I didn't expect two strangers to invite me in, and closed the door quietly behind me. That moment changed everything. It was one of those quiet evenings where the city feels slightly out of sync with itself. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional chatter drifting from open windows, and the soft, golden light of street lamps painting long shadows across the pavement. I had just finished running errands, my hands still faintly sticky from the grocery bags, when I noticed two women standing outside their apartment building. They were familiar faces from the neighborhood, though I had never spoken to them beyond a polite nod or brief hello in passing. Both were striking in different ways, one tall and poised, with a gentle elegance that seemed to anchor her presence, the other slightly shorter, with a playful lightness in her expression. Yet her eyes held a depth that hinted at private sorrows. As I approached, one of them stepped forward, her voice soft yet confident. "Would you like to come in for a moment?" There was no urgency, no expectation, only a quiet invitation that made my chest tighten slightly. Something in the way they moved, their easy, natural grace, made the request feel less like a casual offer and more like the opening of a door I wasn't entirely prepared to walk through. For a brief moment, hesitation flickered in my mind. Should I accept? Was it appropriate? Yet curiosity, combined with an inexplicable sense of trust, won over. I nodded, a little awkwardly, and followed them to the apartment entrance. The first detail that struck me was the soft click of the door closing behind me. It was subtle, almost inaudible, but it marked the threshold between the outside world and a private space, a transition that made the air inside feel charged with possibility. The apartment smelled faintly of vanilla and old books, with a hint of perfume lingering in the corners. It was cozy, lived in, and somehow reassuring, a sharp contrast to the impersonal rush of the streets I had just left. They guided me toward a small seating area, their gestures calm and unhurried, each movement carrying a quiet elegance. One of them adjusted the edge of her scarf, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear, while the other offered me a chair with a soft, welcoming smile. There was no need for small talk yet. The silence between us was comfortable, filled with an almost magnetic tension. My senses felt heightened, the gentle creak of the floorboards beneath our steps, the muted ticking of a clock, the way the afternoon light filtered through the curtains and danced on the rug. Everything seemed amplified, intimate, and intentional. Even in those first moments, I was acutely aware of the subtle gestures. A hand lightly brushing against the corner of a table, a glance exchanged between them, the way their eyes flicked toward me and then away. It was as though they were inviting me not just into their home, but into a fragile, unspoken world. One layered with curiosity, quiet warmth, and something just beneath the surface, impossible to name. As I sank into the chair, feeling the soft fabric under my fingertips, I realized I was no longer just a passerby in their lives. In that suspended, quiet space, something shifted. An unspoken acknowledgement that this ordinary evening might become extraordinary, and that the simple act of being invited in could change everything. After settling into the cozy seating area, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if the apartment itself were aware of our presence and reluctant to disturb the fragile balance we had entered. The two widows moved with quiet composure, each step deliberate and unhurried. One wandered toward a small bookshelf, her fingers tracing the spines of worn novels as if absorbing their stories silently. The other lingered near the window, brushing her hair behind her shoulder, her eyes briefly catching mine before turning back to watch the sun dip lower, painting the room in gentle amber hues. I could feel the rhythm of the space, measured, calm, and intimate, without a single word exchanged. I sat there, observing more than I spoke, acutely aware of every tiny detail. The warmth from the tea they had offered seeped through the porcelain cup into my hands, grounding me in the moment. The sound of the tea steeping, the faint clink of the spoon against the ceramic, and the subtle creak of the floorboards became almost hypnotic in their simplicity. Everything was magnified, the way one widow's hand lingered for a fraction longer than necessary on the edge of the table, the other's subtle sigh as she leaned slightly against the window frame. It was in these small, almost imperceptible gestures that their true presence revealed itself. Their eyes were captivating, not in the way of overt beauty, but in the quiet depth they carried. I could see traces of past sorrows in the slight tightness around their eyes, the way they occasionally paused as if remembering something far away, yet their faces were softened by warmth and a gentle patience. There was no rush, no urgency, just the slow unfolding of someone fully inhabiting the present, with an awareness that made even a casual glance feel meaningful. I found myself drawn into that awareness, feeling simultaneously like an outsider and a participant in something deeply personal. The room seemed to amplify the smallest gestures. The subtle shift of a shoulder, the way their fingers touched the rim of a cup, the faint scent of perfume mingling with the warm, earthy smell of the apartment. All of it layered into a rich sensory tapestry. My heart thumped quietly, not out of fear, but from the delicate tension in the air, a sense that every movement, every glance, was part of an unspoken dialogue. I was learning to read it slowly, letting the silence between us carry meaning that words could not. As minutes passed, I realized the widows were observing me as much as I was observing them. Their attentiveness was gentle, never invasive, but it created a subtle intimacy that made the space feel smaller, closer, warmer. It was a quiet test of connection, a way of gauging whether I belonged in this delicate, private world they had opened to me. And in that suspended moment, I felt a strange mix of vulnerability and comfort. Vulnerable because I was fully seen, comfortable because their presence was patient, accepting, and quietly welcoming. In that room, filled with soft light, faint aromas, and the weight of unspoken histories, I understood that the evening was no longer ordinary. I was being drawn into a space of gentle observation, a slow unfolding of connection, where the smallest details spoke volumes, and silence was as charged as any conversation. After several quiet moments of observation, the room slowly began to warm, not with temperature, but with a subtle rhythm of shared presence. One of the widows picked up her tea, tilting the cup to catch the sunlight streaming through the window, and murmured a story about a childhood memory, a small and seemingly insignificant moment, yet told with such care that it made me lean forward instinctively, eager to hear more. The other widow offered a soft laugh at a minor anecdote, and the sound was light, melodic, yet tinged with a fragility that hinted at both joy and loss. For the first time, I felt like a part of the space, not an intruder. Their words were gentle, deliberate, like a stream of warmth flowing slowly, touching one corner of the room and then another. Each story they shared was layered, not just with what was said, but with what lingered unsaid. There was humor, faint nostalgia, and an undercurrent of longing, carefully balanced so that the tales never felt heavy, yet always carried weight. I responded with quiet observations, sometimes laughing softly, sometimes pausing to reflect. My voice, though younger, was met with patient attention, their eyes scanning me briefly as though weighing not what I said, but the care behind it. I noticed the subtle choreography of gestures, the way one widow's fingers lightly brushed the teacup as if memorizing its warmth, the other leaning slightly forward when emphasizing a point, eyes flicking momentarily toward mine, just long enough to create a small jolt of connection. It was unspoken, effortless, a language of presence and intention that did not need translation. My own movements became more aware, the way my hands rested on my knees, how I adjusted my posture, how I allowed my gaze to linger on their expressions for just a heartbeat longer than usual. Even the silences held meaning. A pause after a story, the quiet clicking of the teaspoon against porcelain, or the faint rustle of fabric as they shifted in their chairs. Each sound became part of a tapestry, threading tension and comfort together. In those pauses, I felt a strange intimacy form, a recognition of shared humanity, of lives that had known pain and joy in equal measure. And yet, there was no pressure, no urgency. The room held us gently, like a tide carrying each of us forward, inch by inch, toward something unspoken, something tentative. It was in these moments that I first felt the subtle pull of attraction, not in a crude or obvious sense, but as a quiet awareness that their presence left impressions on my body and mind. The warmth of their gestures, the soft cadence of their voices, the way their eyes seemed to measure not my age, but my attentiveness and sincerity. It all created a magnetic, unspoken tension. And while I dared not voice the thoughts forming in my mind, I could not deny the way my chest tightened, how my pulse seemed to respond to the rhythm of their conversation. By the time the stories had faded into a comfortable lull, I realized I was no longer merely a guest. I had become a participant in a delicate exchange, one built from laughter, reflection, and subtle emotional resonance. In that apartment, bathed in the soft glow of afternoon light, the quiet intimacy of shared moments began to etch itself into memory, planting seeds for connections that promised to grow in ways I could neither predict nor control. The conversation had settled into a quiet rhythm, and I noticed the subtle shifts in how the widows arranged themselves. One of them gestured toward the couch, a small, almost casual invitation. Yet the way her eyes lingered on me made it feel purposeful. I hesitated for a moment, aware of the intimacy implied by the closeness, before moving to sit beside her. The soft fabric of the couch pressed against my arm, and I realized how the room seemed suddenly smaller, the air warmer, almost electrically charged with anticipation. As we sat, the widows subtly adjusted their positions too. One shifted slightly closer, letting her knee nearly brush mine. A movement that was easy to dismiss as accidental, but my chest tightened at the awareness of proximity. The other, across from me, leaned forward with a delicate tilt of her head, brushing her fingers over the edge of her teacup. Every small gesture seemed intentional, yet effortless, a dance of closeness that spoke volumes without a single word. It was the first time our physical spaces overlapped in a way that felt intimate rather than casual, and the sensation was both exhilarating and unnerving. The quiet hum of the apartment, the soft ticking of the clock, the faint creak of the floorboards, the subtle rustle of fabric as we shifted, became amplified in the hush between us. I was acutely aware of the warmth radiating from their bodies, the slight scent of perfume mixing with the faint aroma of tea, the way the afternoon light glinted in their eyes. My senses felt heightened. Every glance, every subtle brush of movement against the couch, carried meaning. I could feel my pulse quicken as I tried to remain composed, reminding myself to breathe slowly, to let the moment unfold naturally. There was a remarkable stillness in how they observed me too. Occasionally, one widow would meet my gaze with a faint, knowing smile, her expression soft yet charged with unspoken questions. I noticed the gentle curve of her fingers as she rested her hand lightly on her lap, and the way her body subtly leaned toward me when I spoke. Even the smallest gestures, a stray lock of hair tucked behind an ear, a half-smile that lingered longer than polite convention allowed, spoke of curiosity and interest, a quiet invitation for me to engage on a deeper, more intimate level. And yet nothing was rushed. The moment stretched, suspended between hesitation and desire. There was a beauty in the restraint, a tension created not by bold actions but by subtle closeness. When our hands accidentally brushed, it was brief, almost fleeting. Yet the warmth lingered on my skin far longer than the contact itself. It was a gentle reminder that intimacy could exist in these quiet gestures, that attraction didn't need words or overt actions to be profound. As the sun dipped lower, casting soft shadows across the room, I realized that this was more than mere conversation. The shared proximity had created an unspoken connection, a magnetic awareness of each other that neither needed to define nor disrupt. In that moment, the apartment no longer felt like a neutral space. It had become a private world, delicate and alive, where every movement, every glance, every soft breath carried weight. And within that weight, a new tension stirred, one that promised to shape the moments yet to come. The atmosphere in the apartment had shifted imperceptibly. Where before there had been light banter and gentle curiosity, now there was a quiet, almost sacred space forming between us. One of the widows, her posture relaxed, yet her fingers fidgeting ever so slightly with the edge of a cushion, began to speak in a tone that was softer, more introspective. She shared a memory of her late husband, not in sorrowful detail, but as a delicate recollection of small moments. A shared morning coffee, the way he would hum in the kitchen, the subtle quirks that only someone who truly knew him would notice. Her voice carried warmth, but also the faint tremor of absence, a vulnerability that drew me in without asking for sympathy. I listened intently, captivated not by the content of the story alone, but by the emotions wrapped within it. The laughter that came through even as she remembered him, the small pauses that spoke of love lost and life quietly endured. It was as though each word laid bare a piece of her heart, and in that space, I felt both honored and slightly unsteady. I realized that this was the first real glimpse into the lives behind the smiles and measured gestures, the quiet humanity that made their presence so magnetic. The other widow watched us both with gentle eyes, her fingers brushing the rim of her teacup. Then, slowly, she joined in, not with a story of the past, but with a reflection on how she navigated life after loss. She spoke of loneliness that could settle quietly like dust, of the small joys that reminded her she was still alive, of the longing for connection that sometimes felt forbidden by age, circumstance, or social expectation. Her words were simple, yet they resonated in the still air like a soft chord. I felt a lump rise in my throat, not from pity, but from the weight of shared humanity and the courage it took to voice such truths. Without realizing it, my hands moved slightly closer, brushing lightly against theirs. Not an intentional gesture of intimacy, but a natural response to the emotional gravity of the moment. I could feel the warmth of their skin, the subtle tremor of fingers brushing a mug, and the way their presence seemed to anchor me. The apartment, once simply a physical space, now felt like a cocoon of trust, a fragile environment where emotions could be exposed and acknowledged without fear or judgment. Even in silence, the room hummed with connection. The faint ticking of the clock, the distant murmur of the city outside, and the soft rustle of fabric as we shifted became the backdrop to a shared understanding. In that quiet, the emotional distance between us shrank, replaced by a sense of intimacy that was profound yet unspoken. I realized that the attraction, subtle though it was, had begun to intertwine with admiration, empathy, and deep respect. By the time the conversation eased into a comfortable pause, I felt changed. Not because of grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but because of the power in being truly seen, in seeing the fragility and resilience of others without judgment. That evening had quietly transformed, moving beyond curiosity or polite acquaintance. A connection had formed, a gentle, delicate bond that neither of us fully understood yet, but one that promised to linger long after the teacups were set down and the sun dipped lower outside the window. The apartment had settled into a hushed, intimate rhythm, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel amplified. The faint ticking of the clock, the gentle rustle of fabric as we shifted in our seats, the soft creak of the floorboards under the occasional step. By now, the earlier vulnerability had settled into something warmer, heavier, an unspoken energy that lingered in the space between us. It was no longer just conversation or observation. It was a delicate dance of awareness, subtle gestures, and silent invitations. One of the widows reached for her teacup, but her fingers brushed against mine in the process. A fleeting contact, accidental in appearance but electric in effect. My pulse jumped, the warmth of her hand lingering longer than it should have. Across from me, the other widow shifted slightly, drawing her chair closer to mine. The small distance between us seemed to shrink in a way that made the air almost tangible, each subtle movement magnified in my awareness. It was a charged silence, a space where words had begun to feel unnecessary, replaced by glances, posture, and the subtlest of touches. Their eyes met mine in moments that seemed suspended in time. A glance held too long to be casual, a soft smile that hinted at curiosity and playful invitation, a tilt of the head that suggested attentiveness and subtle acknowledgement. I found myself consciously measuring my reactions, how I shifted, how I let my gaze linger, how I allowed a small exhale of breath to carry a fraction of the tension between us. Every gesture, every heartbeat, felt amplified in this intimate bubble. Even the simplest actions carried weight. When one widow adjusted a cushion, her fingers brushed against mine as I helped reposition it. A subtle warmth traveled along my skin, a reminder of proximity that felt far more intimate than the act warranted. The other widow leaned forward to share a quiet comment, and the movement brought our knees near enough that I felt a small, almost imperceptible brush. It was electric, yet restrained, never crossing boundaries, always hovering on the edge of intimacy. The room seemed to respond to our presence as much as we responded to each other. The light softened as the sun lowered, shadows stretching across the walls and wrapping us in a cocoon of golden warmth. The air carried the faint aroma of perfume mingled with tea, subtle yet evocative, and it added to the weight of anticipation that pressed gently against my chest. I realized I was acutely aware of every detail, the tilt of a shoulder, the curve of a smile, the almost imperceptible lean toward me, the quiet sighs that punctuated conversation. It was in this suspended state that I understood the delicate complexity of desire. Not the hurried, impulsive longing of youth, but a slow, magnetic pull shaped by curiosity, respect, and emotional connection. It was tension without pressure, attraction without rush, and intimacy without expectation. Every brush of fingers, every shared glance, every quiet pause in speech became a language of its own, a conversation conducted entirely through presence and attention. By the time the sun dipped lower, casting long golden streaks across the floor, the air between us held a quiet promise. Something unspoken had grown. Curiosity, warmth, a subtle yearning, but it remained delicately poised, fragile and beautiful. We were on the cusp of revelation, suspended in a moment where everything mattered, yet nothing was forced. The tension lingered, palpable, alive, and entirely irresistible. The room felt softer now, bathed in the gentle glow of the late afternoon sun as it filtered through the curtains, painting the apartment in warm, golden hues. The earlier tension and quiet anticipation had slowly given way to a new, delicate rhythm, one of understanding, shared comfort, and subtle fulfillment. The widows and I sat in a quiet circle of trust, each aware of the other, yet careful not to disturb the fragile intimacy that had grown over the course of the afternoon. One of the widows reached for her teacup, lifting it in a casual gesture, yet her eyes lingered on me with a soft intensity that conveyed more than words could capture. I responded with a slight smile, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with proximity or touch, and everything to do with recognition, the sense of having been seen, truly seen, by two people whose lives had been shaped by love, loss, and resilience. Across from me, the other widow leaned back slightly, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear, a movement that seemed almost ceremonial, marking the quiet closure of this shared chapter of the day. There was no dramatic confession, no sweeping declaration of feelings. Instead, the connection between us manifested in small, profound gestures, the gentle brush of a hand across a forearm, a lingering glance that held both curiosity and acceptance, the soft, almost imperceptible leaning closer when speaking. Even the briefest touch seemed charged with meaning, a promise of presence and attentiveness without demanding more than what the moment could give. I realized, as I watched them both, that the story of the afternoon had never been about romance in the traditional sense. It was about connection, intimacy, and the recognition of shared vulnerability. Each of us carried histories, memories of love, of absence, of longing, that could not be erased. Yet in this quiet apartment, these histories had aligned in a way that allowed us to exist fully in the present, free of judgment and expectation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, one widow rose first, walking to the window and adjusting the curtains to soften the last rays of light. The other followed more slowly, their movements graceful, measured, as though reluctant to break the spell of our shared space. I stood too, feeling the subtle shift in energy, the unspoken acknowledgement that the afternoon had reached its natural conclusion. Before I left, there was a moment of lingering eye contact, a gentle smile shared between each of us, carrying the weight of unspoken gratitude and quiet affection. A soft handshake, almost accidental, lingered longer than necessary, and for a heartbeat, I felt the magnetic pull of the connection that had formed, complex, subtle, and unforgettable. Then, the door closed behind me with a soft click, marking both an ending and a continuation. The world outside awaited, yet a part of that delicate afternoon remained with me, quietly reshaping the way I thought about connection, intimacy, and trust. Walking back into the streets, I carried a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun or the comfort of a couch. It was a warmth born of understanding and shared presence, a lingering emotional resonance that promised to shape my thoughts and memories for days to come. We had not needed to define our connection, nor had we rushed to categorize it. The resolution was perfect in its subtlety. A moment of human closeness that left an indelible impression, quiet yet profound, and entirely unforgettable. If this story touched you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more slow-burn romances that linger in the heart. And comment below, what would you have done if you were in his shoes?